Welcome to Escapists Anonymous, the fantasy fiction book club. I'm Dan.
And I'm Sam. This is a podcast for people who love to read and who read to escape into worlds of magic and adventure. But don't let that adventure end when you finish your book.
Join us on Escapists Anonymous to carry on the conversation.
All right, another new episode, another new book. Goodbye, the palate cleanser that was sci-fi, and welcome back to the comforting aromas and flavors of fantasy. Another one set in the real world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab.
Yeah.
Now, previous episode, at the very end, you said that it was vampires. And I feel like because reading the blurb, which we'll come to in a sec, I hadn't realised it was going to be vampires. And I started reading it going, oh yeah, it is a bit vampires. And then I was like, oh, this is very vampires.
Yeah.
This is one of the most vampire books I've read. And we've read Serpent and the Wings of Night.
Yeah, this is Interview with a Vampire with
Isn't
Lesbians.
it? Yeah, it's this sapphic Interview with a Vampire.
Yeah.
I had that as one of my top notes as well. Like the structure of it feels so similar. Like Sabine is Lestat.
Yeah.
And Lottie is Louis.
Yeah.
You know, it's very, very similar. I mean, big differences and stuff we'll discuss. Very bold with the vampire lore, like new mechanics, rejigging some other stuff. Loved it. Keeps it fresh. But we should... New book, new blurb.
Indeed.
And we can discuss this because, as I said, I have some opinions on this. This is a story about hunger. 1532, Santo Domingo de la Calzada. A young girl grows up wild and wily, her beauty only outmatched by her dreams of escape. But Maria knows she can only ever be a prize or a pawn in the games played by men. When an alluring stranger offers an alternate path, Maria makes a desperate choice she vows to have no regrets. This is a story about love, 1827, London. A young woman lives in an idyllic but cloistered life on her family's estate until a moment of forbidden intimacy sees her shipped off to London. Charlotte's tender heart and seemingly impossible wishes are swept away by an invitation from a beautiful widow, but the price of freedom is higher than she could ever have imagined. This is a story about rage, 2019, Boston. College was supposed to be her chance to be someone new. That's why Alice moved halfway across the world, leaving her old life behind. But after an out-of-character one-night stand leaves her questioning her past, her present and her future, Alice throws herself into the hunt for answers and revenge. This is a story about life, how it ends and how it starts again. Now, no mention of vampires there.
No, but it's pretty cool in the way that now that you know it's about vampires, you're like, oh yeah, that seems totally appropriate and not in any way misleading.
Yeah, exactly. It is telling the truth while omitting some important things. And I wonder what the purpose was, because like people love vampires. If you mention vampires, a lot of people are going to be like, oh, vampires. But maybe it wants to appeal to people who, when they hear vampires, go, oh, vampires.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because there's no mention of lesbians either.
Which can also be a draw for some people.
Well, it's like it's making very deliberate choices not to sort of foreground the very key elements of what the
queer vampire love story. Yeah.
So it's like interesting choices, but I mean I think it's a very well written blurb. I'm impressed by their ability to weave all of the plots in without really giving even the slightest thing away about the story.
Exactly. Like reading it, I'm like, oh, is this going to be a bit like Cloud Atlas? You know, like interconnected lives, recurring themes of like male oppression, you know, liberation, all this kind of stuff. And I was thinking, where does the fantasy come in? And I was thinking, bury our bones. Oh, maybe all of these women die and their souls are intertwined in this, you know, in some way or something like that. But no, vampires.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that the blurb sort of went through chronologically in terms of its introduction of our three characters, because in my head, or maybe more on reflection, I thought actually Alice is the main character in this book.
Interesting.
But very interesting discussions to have. I think we spend less time with her than anybody else, but it almost feels like the whole story is like a flashback. So like Alice has had this thing happening, but then the origin of Alice and that one night stand and what that's led to has gone back all the way to Maria back in the 16th century in Spain.
Yeah, and there is that nature of looking for who the main character is. And for me, the person who we spend the most time with is Maria/Sabine.
Yeah.
And it's about her fall from grace and how she loses touch with her humanity. And it's almost like a tragic story as this person becomes corrupted. Because for me, Alice isn't the main character. She is, she's the Christian Slater journalist character from the film, in Interview with the Vampire, who's being recounted these things. But even then, she's not even being told a lot of this stuff. So her story almost provides a bookend. And I feel at the end of the book, spoilers, by the way, for everything we're discussing. At the end of the book, it's when her story can truly begin, because she is bound up. And if we don't go with the tree metaphor, buried in the amongst the in the soil, and in amongst the roots are all intertwined. She can only extricate herself and become free when these two vampires die.
Yeah,
because she is caught up in their psychodrama. It's got a gravity of its own and it's pulled her in. So that's kind of, for me, she is struggling to get her own story. Not as in like in a bad way, but like it can only begin once they're done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was very aware when I was thinking Alice is the main character that not everybody's going to agree with that. But I think she is our sort of constant reference point back,
and she's
when
we're
going
relatable.
Through Sabine's, she's the most relatable. She's our kind of key current perspective, and I guess it makes sense based on your response there that we do spend less time with her than we would spend with the others, because actually, like you say, her story is she hasn't had a chance to really start her story. She's been, and that's kind of part of the whole story that we do get of her, is that she's just been secondary to her sister's story, to her dad and his new wife's story. She's just setting out on this new adventure in Boston, and then she gets turned into a vampire, like
and it kind of messes with her whole life plan.
and
like that is why and she is a basis for this revision of the vampire myth that we see here. Like, we learn a lot about it from the other characters, but, there's almost this kind of ethical twist that, we've seen in other vampire stuff. But, it's often, like in Buffy, Angel's like going on this massive massacre, and then he's like, no, I get my soul, and now I feel all angsty about things. And, like Louis eventually deciding like that he wants to be more kind of like good about it. But this is like, she wants to be ethical from the off. Like, she's had a slightly rocky start, kills that guy behind the tree, but then he was a sexual predator, so it's kind of justified in some way. But like, she doesn't want to do any killing. And we see this progression of Sabine, who's just like, murder, murder, kill, kill. And then Lottie's like, murder, kill? Is this okay? I'm not okay with it. Whereas Alice is like, no, none of this at all, please. Don't want any of this.
Although I feel like Lottie's story is potentially a little bit more cloudy than the story that we get. I think there's some of that unreliable...
What I think is really interesting is, when she dies, I thought, I wasn't expecting this, because I thought she was kind of the good guy. But then on reflection, she was going down a similar path to Sabine, arguably, or like slightly different, but still equally morally compromised. Because there's an implication after Alice has killed Sabine, where it's like, is Lottie still planning on killing her? Because, like, Sabine's like, don't forget about Penny, like, Lottie killed her. And we know when Ezra questioned her, I've got the the quote here. Hold on. Either these girls matter more than your need for love, or they don't. And, you know, it's that kind of thing of like Lottie has her own emotional needs in the way that Sabine had. You know, Sabine wanted, you know, Lottie more than anything. And Lottie just wanted to be loved in the way that she wanted. And so she was going around still having these relations with girls, knowing that Sabine was going to kill them or turn them.
Yeah.
And she was like, well, it's kind of more about me than it is about them. And there's that darkness that appears over Lottie's face, which is the thing that tips Alice over into going, no, I will let you drink that poisoned blood, actually, because I'm not sure about where this is going.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the stories that we're told, obviously none of it's first person, but all of the
italics
perspective characters are, we only know what the characters know. We're getting their story, but in the third person. So there's this, I noticed this sort of, I think, very deliberate and convenient, like skipping over of some of the horrible stuff that Lottie didn't want to talk about. So, you know, it's like they spent their time in beautiful houses over the centuries. It's like where they had massacred the families that lived there and just moved in. And obviously we get one scene where they go to do that. And then that's the moment where Sabine starts to, you know, lose her humanity, I guess, is the way that you phrased it. And so she sort of starts to pull away from Sabine. But I think there's a lot of that that's happened. Yeah. And a lot of it that Lottie's sort of version of events doesn't feel very nice about including in her story.
Yeah, and that's why Lottie's story in itself feels lighter than Sabine's, even though she's been around for hundreds of years. Like, you see that time skip where it goes from, like, she leaves Sabine and then it jumps to her, like, you know, in France and England, and then the 1920s, and then after that we go, what, 1957, 1994? You know, she's avoiding talking about a lot of stuff in her time period. Like, I don't know if it's just because you know, we're getting towards the end of the book and V.E. Schwab's like, come on. But, you know, we don't get that kind of depth that we see with the locations that Sabine is in. You know, we have Venice, we have her touring Spain with Renata and Hector. Yeah. You know, we see what she does, and, you know, she revels in it, she learns. And Lottie, it's like, I think you raise a really good point. Like, she is kind of going, we saw places, things, experiences, big piles of murder and whatever. That's fine.
Yeah, exactly that, basically. But I think that's like a very deliberate thing around her personality. And like, she wants to see herself as this kind of virtuous, you know, like different from Sabine. Like she's really kind of trying to create a differentiation. Like, no, I'm a good vampire and she's a bad vampire, and but like there is some, you know, some murder.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few like allegories that vampirism is useful within this one book. It's quite like metaphor dense, and one of them is the vampire as social parasite. You know, like, they are people who live in high society, but they contribute nothing. They only take. You know, when they live in the nice fancy houses, because they've killed someone for it. They have all the nice dresses because they've stolen money, and they are like an inherently malignant presence within the story, regardless of how they act.
Apart from perhaps the original Sabine, who set up apothecary stores and sold goods to the public, which is, I guess, you're kind of one exception to the rule, and she just gets killed straight away. Yeah,
because, you know, she's clearly a weaker vampire, because like Sabine's Maria is freshly turned and just like, and Sabine doesn't fight back. So we don't know. I mean, like, clearly, I think that original Sabine 1, is draining people and killing people. We don't see it, do we? But we don't know the source of how she gets her blood, whether she leaves them alive. But, you know, the ones we see in detail, all of them have taken them from someone. I think the only other one who what's interesting is Matteo and Ezra. They are both people who are trying to live more in harmony. Like, is Matteo living in this house? Has he killed the people for it, or has he earned it himself? He seems to have been living in Venice for a while, and is this kind of very like
isn't it what's his
Alessandro?
Isn't it Alessandro's house, and he's living
there
in
you go. Like he there's a reciprocal nature there, isn't there? You know, so we can see there's a possibility for it, but the people we follow, particularly Sabine too, and Lottie, they just take. You know, like they live off of other people's things. And, you know, it also then merges over with this being a metaphor for the aristocracy, isn't it? Like, as much as we see them talking about, like, oh, you know, sometimes we hunt for pleasure within the aristocracy, but really most of their feeding comes from the working class and the poor, the people who society won't miss. And so as much as Lottie's talking about, like, oh, I care about these people, it's like, they are your playthings. They are things that you use. And when we're applying these kind of lenses to the act of vampirism, then, like, you're inherently an antagonist in this story. You are not a force for good.
Yeah. Just on that note, what wound me up was, like, why hasn't Lottie, in some of these examples, said to these girls, especially the ones that she, like, stays with for a while, and then inevitably Sabine turns up and murders them, or turns them into a vampire. It's like, just say, if someone called Sabine turns up,
because she doesn't care.
Yeah, maybe you're right. I'd kind of thought, is that just she's trying to hide that whole thing and just bury her head in the sand and hope that it doesn't happen?
Yeah, she's trying to, like, I'm protecting them in the same way that it's infuriating in so many stories. Or like, I didn't tell you because I wanted to protect you. It's like, preparation is the way to protect someone.
Me having some weapons on my general person to protect myself with.
Carry some grave dirt in your bag at all times to fling at Sabine, you know, like, just something. And I think that's it, is like, she wanted to live the fantasy, and that's all it is. And they just leave, and the trail of destruction that's behind them is for someone else to pick apart.
Yeah, because there isn't much real reflection on any of that stuff that happens, other than, like, I'm so annoyed that Sabine keeps following me. It's not like, oh, I'm devastated about this person that's that I was spending my life with, or but
we've got that whole thing of the abusive relationship, and again that moment towards the very end of the book where Alice sees the darkness pass over Lottie is because, you know, and she questions, is it because Lottie still loves Sabine in some way and is going to always resent her for having killed her one true love? Like, as much as Sabine and Lottie were a terrible relationship, and Lottie was very much a victim within that, you know, like, they are intertwined in their acts and deeds, and she was still complicit and active in doing some of the horrible things. Like, I think the whole abusive relationship is really interesting because it ties in with a lot of this additional vampire metaphor, the invasive nature of it. You know, I thought one of the interesting new mechanics was this idea that you can create space, the idea of making a home and owning an area. What did you think about that as an addition to the vampire lore? Because I don't think I've heard that before.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's the first time I've heard that. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting, but I wasn't sure that it was used in a way that was incredibly effective.
Okay.
Especially with Lottie, you know, I would think if you've got someone generally kind of stalking you and hunting you and the lovers that you choose down, you could use that mechanism.
I think it was interesting because we've always had this idea of, oh, you must be welcomed in, and vampires have always been subject to that rule. Having them as the creators of that rule also adds a dynamic of they can invade each other's space. You know, like, they pull someone towards them, they reject them, and so it means that they can form their own homes as well. And so you see it being used positively by Matteo. Like, he uses it to have ownership of a space and make a new home. And I thought that's really positive. And then Sabine's like, I use it to reject you and keep you at arm's length. That when Lottie tries to walk into the room and can't, it's not about empowerment. It's about, like, you know, I get to control where you can and can't go.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the other one is the promise you'll never hurt me thing.
Yeah.
Which Lottie obviously takes as just some words, and she's being manipulated into saying something that becomes extremely relevant for the next several centuries.
I think that whole promise thing as well, that ties into, there's not a huge amount of discussion about what causes the vampirism in this one. I think that can be quite common in like more recent postmodern stuff where it's like, oh, it's a disease. Oh, it's like, who knows? It's not seemingly it's tied not even to religion because crosses don't hurt them, but death and life seem to be an important aspect. And with this kind of magical element of, what words have meaning, it has this kind of like, there is like some kind of power behind it that dictates the rules, because that's not kind of a natural organic thing. That's a social thing. That's something that is part of civilization, that the words can bind you. So there is a kind of a consciousness behind whoever's created the rules of vampirism.
Yeah, you'd be interested to because we don't get any more uses of that type of power, and surely there are other words that could directly contradict that
I think
cause some
the limited
confusion.
use of this promising, it's mentioned by, I think, Renata earlier in the book, and I think its use within the lore of vampirism in this book is purely as a mechanic for why Lottie just can't kill Sabine.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's like, because you have this length of time where Lottie's on the run, maybe it got added in because someone reading the book before it got published was like, why doesn't she just kill her? And she's like, oh, she can't because of a promise, you know?
Yeah.
And it is one of the more underdeveloped ones, and it raises this question of how the vampirism works. But, I still thought, as vampire laws go, it's pretty good. And the idea that you slowly descend towards death anyway, like it's not an immortal thing. It's about how hard you work to keep it at bay. Like people slowly lose themselves, become darker, submit to the madness. Like Hector and Renata, I feel like their half-life is a lot shorter than, say, for instance, Matteo, because they just give in to the animalistic rage and the bloodshed, and they're quite happy to shed their humanity for the bright burning flame of like this hedonistic, like carnal rage.
Yeah, definitely. And now you've sort of mentioned them all. I think some of those side characters were used really, really well to like bring Maria / Sabine too on that kind of journey of sort of self-understanding and like it added some sexiness in the case of Renata and but Matteo and was Alessandro, that whole thing just broke my heart. I was like, it was really, really emotional, and like Alessandro's last week where it describes his sort of rapid decline and death, and then Matteo's just absolutely forlorn. It was just a really kind of human thing to introduce into a story about vampires.
It shows that the strength of vampires comes from retaining their humanity. Like Matteo is the most powerful, longest lasting vampire, and he's done it through making sure he is always connected to humanity. And this is the discussion and the kind of like the inner fight going on but within Sabine too, because she gets turned, has no kind of like sire there to guide her, meets Hector and Renata, and that indulges in that, I want to be free, I want to do what I want to do, reject the male control, all this kind of stuff. And then she meets Matteo being like, I'm a man, I'm not this negative archetype that you've seen, these controlling men. I'm here to teach you how to empower yourself and have that discussion about like humanity is great, look how I can still fall in love with a human, and I embrace the fact that he dies and it's tragic, but goes on. It's just that, and the point where he messes up is his rebound lover, Giovanni, is the complete opposite. And he turns him into a vampire, and it goes horribly wrong. And Sabine never learns any lesson from that. And that's the start of her, like, she's like, oh, maybe I should turn someone. It's like, no, don't turn the person you love into a vampire. Like, that's what Matteo said. Like, if you want to connect with humanity on that deepest level, you keep them around you and you learn to love them and let them make that choice. Don't don't engage with it in this level. And I think, that's where Sabine has that turning point and heads down the inevitable road towards the madness that she kind of like finds herself in.
Yeah. It was interesting to have Matteo as, I thought, in general, like this, like very positive, fatherly, like authority figure that we actually respect, because I think in general, like the approach towards men in this book is, not particularly sort of positive. And it was interesting that she chose to have it as a male vampire that was like, you're in my town and you play by my rules, or you get out of my town, and blah blah blah.
But it's to show that there is like the kind of like the kind of toxic male presence that she escaped isn't the only thing that exists. And Sabine reacts positively to it, but doesn't necessarily learn all the lessons of this is it. I mean, then we cross over into the idea that vampirism is all a metaphor for queerness as well, because, like Matteo is he's a queer man with his lover. And, most of the vampires we see are in some way kind of like they're within the kind of like the queer spectrum of however much they want to engage with other same-sex relationships. So that's where Matteo is also offering that. Like, that's where he exists within this kind of like the various metaphors of positive, negative approach. Like, vampires in this idea are they are people who exist outside of the normal society, especially throughout history. They've been sidelined, forced to live in the shadows. They have their own secret societies. They have their own terminologies like, oh, we are feral roses buried in the midnight soil, this kind of stuff. Like, this is exactly the kind of way that communication existed within queer communities throughout history. So, like, there's that whole metaphor as well. And that's where Matteo exists within a positive sphere as a male, because he is still queer. He is not a heterosexual, masculine presence, like Maria's husband was.
Yeah. So just on Sabine, I was a big fan of her sort of story arc and her I guess sort of descent into madness, but I don't know if descent is the right word, because I think the tendencies were
always there,
and like which I think is great. My question is that moment where she gets turned into a vampire and then she immediately kills Sabine 1. That was a real surprise to me. Like, I thought she'd built up a lot of trust with this, and I guess on reflection I was like, it's this feeling of power and this desire for absolute control that she's never had and she's wanted, and she gets it. But I was really surprised that she immediately kind of used it on Sabine 1, who had been that kind of source of refuge for her.
That's why her and Lottie make such a good couple, because ultimately it's their own personal gain, pleasure, that's the thing that trumps anything. So when she turns, it would be great to have Sabine there to guide her, but in that moment, all she wants is the power, the heartbeat, that's all she wants, and so like it overrides any kind of like consideration of, oh, it would be good to keep Sabine around because she's selfish.
But I think Sabine 1 has some responsibility here, because both in the example of Sabine 1 turning Maria into a vampire and Sabine 2 turning Lottie, at no point is there like, by the way, I'm going to turn you into a vampire and it means X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, then there's a risk that she's just going to get this bloodlust and, and that's going to be the end of it.
But then that's also ties in with, again, these metaphors of like the hidden love, like you don't talk about it, like, and I think that ties in a bit with the queerness. Like, you just didn't want to, there wasn't necessarily even words for it. It was a passion, a drive, and you don't say the word. Like when you're like that's the whole thing. So I can kind of understand as to why they don't want to say it, and they use all these metaphors and talk around it, because it's something that almost seems like it has to remain unsaid until you're kind of like, you're trusted and you're part of it. But I mean, functionally, you're absolutely right. You'd think it would make sense to be like, okay, if I'm going to turn you, this is X, Y, and Z. But I think also once you start revealing all of that, and they go like, oh no, actually I'm out. They go, oh well, I'm going to have to kill you.
Yeah. You could, yeah. I'm sure there's a way around it.
Yeah,
I'd like to think so. How would you like to have almost eternal life, but you might, have to do some horrible things along the way?
yeah, and like, there's caveats and addendums,
Yeah. So see read the small print, but
yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I loved her descent into madness and like because we'd had that hinting from Matteo around, or was it from Matteo where he's talking about like we're not immortal, we just have like a very long life, and eventually it one way or another it manifests as like a sort of detachment from our original and whoever we were.
And the implication is that he's a very old vampire and he's worked the hardest to keep it. And, and I think that's what the storytelling around Matteo's character is so good, because there's so much hinted at and there's no real attempt to tell us. And, I like the kind of glimpses we get because it's just lost. He's done this before. It takes centuries. Like the whole arc of where he's been and his experiences are so long that he's seen things come and go that, Sabine isn't really ready to even comprehend. And at that point, with her being alive for a couple of 100 years. And, I like the idea that he then goes off to America, and I would have been disappointed if we saw him again.
There was a moment where I thought maybe Ezra was Matteo, and he sort of reinvented himself, and that, But then obviously, I think you're right, and I think it was good that it wasn't him. I just think that was there was an assumption because he'd gone off to America, and then
and we know the community's small, but it would have seemed too coincidental for that to have happened. So I like that he came and he offered all this advice, gave her a perspective, and she was just like, "I'll pick this bit and this bit and this bit, and all the rest of it is nonsense." And you have his voice in the back of her head, throughout the rest of the story, and she's just like, ugh. Tries to ignore some of the bits that she doesn't like the sound of. And it's fine because, each vampire, I'm sure, brings their own philosophy to how they approach it. But, hers is to ignore what is some well-founded wisdom based on centuries of experience.
Yeah, but also as individuals, we all have different levels of willpower and self-control, and that's, that's really relevant here. I was going to ask you about Alice's kind of flashback story to her sister. Like, what did you make of that inclusion, and how relevant did you find it to the general plot?
Yeah, I had to have a good think about this one because, it fleshed out Alice's backstory. We know where she is. She's like you. I think you put it quite well. Like, she's been a side character in everyone else's drama, and she now wants to just have her own time and her own life, and so we understand all of that. And it's only when Catty dies and fails to achieve her dreams, she hadn't been traveling, she'd been living in Glasgow on the streets, for this entire time, and Alice wanted to make an achievement on behalf of her sister, continue all of that. It gave us a good amount of knowledge. I found some of the story a bit annoying. I thought Catty was an annoying character because but it was a good counterpoint to Alice. Alice is like, Elle isn't so terrible, and maybe we can kind of love her. And Catty at no point is just like, yeah, maybe you're right. She's just like, no, I hate her. She's the worst. It's like she's like, we're supposed to like Eloise, she's a lovely woman by all accounts. There's no kind of secret evil. So it almost makes Alice wanting to kind of live out her sister's dreams and honor her is but she was an asshole.
Yeah, but again, it ties into toxic relationships.
Yeah,
again, doesn't it? They're not just romantic relationships. Family relationships can be.
Yeah,
I mean, and often are messy, and we love people in spite of all of their shortcomings. And I think Catty was she was a really angry teenager. That and hugely damaged by the death of her mother, and sort of directing that at this lovely woman that just wanted to try and be a positive presence in her life. And
I'm glad there that the love and the positivity won out in a way. Like she doesn't ever manage to break up or trouble the relationship between their father and Elle. You know, like it remains strong. And I think Catty's like hitting up against that. And it's kind of, there's a futility to it of like, oh, if I just keep being horrible and aggressive, then I'll win out and get my way. And it doesn't work. And I thought that was actually quite a positive theme in that part of the story. I mean, there was some point where when it cut to another one of those flashbacks, I was like, okay, let's get through the flashbacks so we can get to the main story. And, you know, so there were perhaps a few too many points where we were cutting back, and I was like, let's move this on. Because I still feel we could have got the essence of this with a little bit less of that.
Yeah. I think that was where I was a lot of the time throughout. I was like, what? Is it important that we know all of this stuff? Like, I guess it's like just trying to make Catty's death as tragic as possible, which I think, you know, I don't know about you, like relatively early on, I was like, I can see where this is heading.
Yeah.
Settings you mentioned, like, start off, I think, like quite detailed as we go from like Spain to you know, Venice and travel around. The last time I feel like we get a little bit of it in that kind of 1920s when Sabine and Lottie are there, but I feel like after that sort of Bridgerton, you know, what would that be? It was like 1827 or something like that. That felt like the last bit where we got like some detail around kind of the setting. But I really loved kind of the fact that it jumped around. That's what I often like about these books that span huge periods of time, is that you get this like look back into history, and if it's done well, it can feel really visceral, and
you get a sense of place really well. You know, you understand. I mean, you know, the Inquisition and all that stuff. You know, being this presence, like, you know, when Maria is with her husband and she's like, "Oh, you can't leave the house unless accompanied," and you have the the Marquis's mother being this woman who is also complicit in propagating this control. She's like, you know, making sure that Maria cannot leave the house, is always monitoring her, is enforcing the rules of this system that's reduced her to this kind of like angry, embittered old woman.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, definitely. I know. I liked a lot of that. I guess one of my only criticisms is when we introduced Charlotte, I felt like the pace really slowed down. Again, it was like almost starting from scratch. Like we'd had Sabine speed up and up and up, and obviously Alice's plot sort of quietly developing on the side. And then all of a sudden it's like, and here's a new character, and we have to do the whole, like, you know, backstory. And
I thought it was interesting that we had Lottie's backstory begin so far into the novel. I don't think it would have detracted too much if it had started a bit earlier, because we know who she is. Like, you know, when it's like Lottie died question mark, it's like, well, we know we know whoever it's going to be a vampire from a previous age, so you can just start telling us about
but also we're having 2019 and 16 whatever it is happen at the same time. Why can't we have 1827 happen at the same time as that?
Why not have it that, like, you know, don't have to know that it's Sabine in her storyline right from the off. You could have her being referred to as the widow, and that being this kind of like, you know, repeating thing. And so we kind of know that it's Sabine, but it's not like, you know, so we can still find out what Sabine has been through as we're catching up, and have all the lives be structured in a more parallel sense of, like, you know, this is their progression. Because, you know, to be honest, it'd be nice to have seen where Sabine and Lottie had different events and they diverged, you know, like, as much as, you know, I've said quite a few times now, Sabine and Lottie are very birds of a feather, and they end up going and doing certain similar things and, you know, atrocities. But, you know, Lottie ends up in a different place as much as she thinks she does. You know, like, how much is where she is in America at this point her Venice, you know, where she's like, oh, I'm learning how to live at one, and we know that, oh, well, you're still going to end up going down that path. And having that maybe being that kind of similar thing. Oh, I see what you think you're doing here, but maybe it's all just history repeating itself.
Yeah. So I have, I guess, kind of two minor criticisms, and then one very sort of positive bit of praise. What shall we do first?
Do the criticisms.
Okay.
We've done quite a lot of praise and construction.
Yeah. I mean, in general, I have to say, really enjoyed it. One criticism is the introduction of a psychic to solve the problem of having to locate Lottie annoyed me. I was like, this is just like, oh, we need to figure out how she's going to find Lottie. We don't really know where Lottie is. We'll just have a psychic. We haven't had any talk about psychics before in the book. We're like, oh, we need to find Lottie. Oh, hey, whatever your name is over there in the next booth in the cafe.
Me with the cards. Oh, hello.
And I was just like, oh, I'm sure there was a better way to do that.
Have it being a modern thing. She found her photo on Facebook. Have her, just have her have some kind of online presence. How even vampires can't avoid it. Have that being a discussion of like vampires are being pulled into the light, as it were, because they can't exist outside of it so easily.
But also, Ezra knew Lottie, so just have her like turn up at the cafe and like somehow Ezra like can track her down and find out. Like, don't introduce some other form of magic that hasn't been mentioned and doesn't get mentioned ever again. I didn't like that. And then the other thing was, I thought the end and the way that Alice managed to kill Sabine especially just felt a little bit like, I'm not sure that Sabine would have really let that happen. Like, I don't know whether you got that. Like, I just think the whole thing about her having to protect her thoughts and how many times during that process it was like, oh, and then I nearly thought about having to kill her, but I didn't. It's like, well, yeah, but you're saying that you were basically thinking it.
Oh, wait, I'm thinking it right now.
Oh,
no, I'm thinking about thinking it right now. And Sabine sitting there going, I can hear all of this.
And that's what I was thinking. I was like, would she not get a sense of... She definitely wouldn't just like then strip off and jump into the shower with
is Sabine losing it too much mentally, and so that she can't, she's not focused anymore, like you could justify that. But yeah, I agree. Like, and at the end also, we've got this kind of conflicted metaphor where, like there's an empowerment in being vampirism. So if we go back to the idea of queerness and, like, oh, it's a secret society, but you can be empowered by being part of this community, yada, yada. But like, ultimately it's her desire to engage in sex above, any kind of like sense of survival is her downfall. It's like, oh, your carnal instincts are the things that will be your end, you know?
Yeah, basically.
And the fact it's like a shard of a sink is this... I feel like it was very kind of a bit messy, a bit kind of like, could there have been a stronger metaphor for how Sabine gets brought down, like that ties into her previous actions?
I kind of wanted it to be a bit more climactic, I guess. Like, she seemed to be such a sort of malevolent... I liked the way they built her up as this force of this, really sort of spooky, stalking, like there's no escape. Like, I think, and sometimes it's good to have it kind of underplayed rather than overplayed as a finish to the story. But yeah, I guess like there was part of me that wanted it to be this big climactic thing.
I mean, power-wise, we know that a newly turned vampire isn't as powerful. So like Alice would have had to have used some kind of... in my mind, I was like, she'll use some clever modern contrivance because Sabine is out of touch. That kind of thing. But yeah, it was a bit underwhelming for the power of Sabine. It had to be this kind of trickery using sex as a way to trick her. Again, it's also like... It just these are powerful women. It just seems like a really kind of crap way to take out this person who's existed for centuries.
But maybe there's something there about like eventually all life is fragile.
Yeah.
And like, it doesn't matter how powerful you are, a knife through the heart.
In terms of the deaths, I did like the mechanic that they effectively turn into like mulch and soil. Like, it's not like, oh, I turn to fire, turn to dust or something like that. It's like they return to the earth, like blah, 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 blah. It's a much more kind of like, because this book, the way it, Midnight Soil, it is grounded in this kind of like earthy, like there is a kind of a very different tone to this as a vampire story compared to others. Like there's so much reference to the returning to the earth. It avoids too many of the fire metaphors. Like we have a bit of fire coming into it, but like it's very much more kind of an earth elemental story rather than a fire elemental story, that kind of thing. And I really liked it. I mean, the grave dirt thing, another cool
that
mechanic.
was cool,
yeah.
That,
And the way that killed Lottie was a much better way to go. I kind of wish that had been for Sabine, and it had been more of an equal fight between Lottie and Alice. But yeah, and I think there's a potential for the story to continue with Alice now, trying to be an ethical vampire. But I do feel when it ended, I was like, I'm happy to not read any more of this story. Like Alice has got a blank slate. She phones her dad. She's going to make her future her own.
Yeah, it's her walking off into the sunrise.
No, don't.
No. But yeah, and my big bit of praise is the writing in general. And whilst it didn't maintain, I just finished that morning when I started it. I just finished Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes, which had this like sort of nostalgic, mid-century American like literary fiction style, sort of languid, poetic. And the first few chapters of this felt very, very poetic and literary fiction-ish. And it didn't really maintain that. It kind of dropped into a more of a just kind of rhythm of what you would expect from like sort of modern fiction. But I found it so easy to, especially as an audiobook as well, to just take in all of the information. Sometimes when I'm listening to a book, it's like I have to really, really concentrate. And sometimes I think that's a reflection of the writing style or whatever.
I felt that the book flowed really well. Like in terms of the writing, there weren't too many points where I was like, "Ooh, what a beautiful bit of description," but it was a very seamless book to read. Like there was never any points where I struggled to get through her writing. So I think there's a certain level of polish and professionalism to the way that it's written that made it very, very easy to engage with.
Yeah.
I wasn't getting lost in any of it.
No. I think those first few chapters, like, I don't know whether it's that enthusiasm of writing the first few chapters that takes you to another level, but they felt quite kind of lyrical in the prose. But yeah, like, thought the writing was very good, very enjoyable. And I guess we should draw some conclusions. It sounds like we both had a pretty good time reading this.
I did. I thought the way that vampirism was used within the story was really strong. Like, she's probably been rolling these ideas over in her mind for quite a while before creating this, and it really shows. There's a coherence to how the vampires work pretty much throughout. Like I said, there's some gripes around some of the magic and some of those things, but she leaves enough. She doesn't over-explain, and that's to the benefit of this story. Yeah, by and large, very positive. Like I say, cut down on the backstory with Catty, structure it slightly differently. Lottie comes in too late in the novel, but overall, I churned through it. It took me less than a week, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was, and like I said, I just found it so easy to, from an audiobook perspective. The audiobook's very well narrated. It's got several different narrators for the different characters, which works well. And yeah, like, I had a great time with it. It was, a few minor little gripes, I think, and we've said with previous books, some of those gripes, they're just about decisions that if I was writing this book, I would have done it slightly differently. It doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It's just a taste thing, and maybe my expectations from other vampire things that I've watched or read, and but yeah, like it was really, really solid, and and again, like I've read other V. Schwab books before and generally enjoyed them, and she's a pretty decent bet, I think, for like just picking up a book and hoping that you'll have a good time. So we always talk about kind of recommending it, and I think we both enjoyed it. I think the great thing about this is it doesn't necessarily feel like a fantasy novel. Like it's I think if you were just into like romance or thrillers or whatever. Like,
and that would explain the blurb. Like
exactly, yeah. They don't want to pigeonhole it in, and obviously it does because it's V. Schwab. It will sit on all of the fantasy sci-fi shelves, but like it works as, you know, as it's as much a fantasy as Interview with a Vampire as a fantasy, or Dracula as a fantasy, or whatever. Like it's vampires, so it's got a foot in the horror world, but it's as much about the kind of toxic relationships. It's interesting. I heard a lot of people describe this as it's like it's about toxic lesbian vampires, and it's like, well, I feel like it's not fair to include the word lesbian there because it's nothing to do with their sexual orientation that makes them toxic. They're just toxic vampires. Like, whether they were straight or queer or whatever. Like,
I'm pretty sure the relationships at the start, which were heterosexual, all negative.
They were toxic as well.
Positive representation of heterosexual relationships. Yeah. I'd recommend it. I'd recommend it to people. Like, I think I'd recommend this to like you say, people who weren't necessarily into fantasy as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Broad appeal.
Broad appeal. There's a good one. But yeah, so there's our conclusions and all of our thoughts. We'd love to hear. Obviously, this is a brand new release this year, only just come out, and people are currently reading it and excited about it. And as I said, V. Schwab's a big name in the fantasy genre, so we'd be super keen to hear any of your views, opinions, having read it. Get in touch either down below in the comments if you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe if you're there as well, or hit us up on social media at Escapist Anonymous Pod on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Leave us a message or a comment, and we would love to hear what you think. Next week we are going from the brand new release to the real kind of backlist, but what I would say is now becoming classic fantasy.
Yeah. So this is one where, like, similar to how we did Discworld, you were reading it for the first time, and it was something I was very familiar with. This is what you've read this a while ago, and I'm now engaging in it, and it is, got it here,
Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn.
Never read anything by this guy before, so
obviously, I probably don't have to introduce Brandon Sanderson. He's likely really the biggest name in modern fantasy. I would argue that's probably an arguable point, but
let us know in the comments.
But the Mistborn trilogy is usually the kind of the gateway into Brandon Sanderson, and I've said to Sam, I think you should read this, and we should have a chat about what your take on it is. So we're going to be covering that in the next episode. So if you haven't read it, then now's your chance, although it's pretty chunky.
It's a big old book. I better get to work.
But lots of you will have read it, so you can join in and on that conversation as well. And yeah, that's everything from us today. So we'll look forward to having you join us in the next episode. And all that's left to say is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.